The crisp autumn air carried the scent of burning leaves, as Eleanor Vance watched her husband Richard back his sleek Mercedes out of the driveway. Their sprawling colonial home, nestled in the affluent suburbs of Connecticut, stood as a testament to their material success. But behind the perfectly manicured lawns and the gleaming windows, Eleanor felt a growing sense of unease, a quiet desperation that gnawed at the edges of her seemingly perfect life. Richard, a driven and successful lawyer, was consumed by his work, his days and nights filled with high-profile cases and demanding clients. He was a good provider, a reliable husband in every practical sense, but emotionally, he was a distant figure, lost in the labyrinth of his own ambition. Eleanor, left to navigate the vast emptiness of their opulent home, found herself increasingly lonely, her days blurring into a monotonous cycle of errands, lunches with equally unfulfilled friends, and evenings spent staring at the silent television screen. It was on one of these particularly lonely afternoons that Eleanor first noticed Daniel. He was the nephew of her next-door neighbor, Mrs. Hawthorne, visiting for the summer. Daniel was everything Richard was not: young, carefree, with a smile that could melt glaciers and eyes that sparkled with an infectious energy. He was a struggling artist, his hands perpetually stained with paint, his clothes a bohemian mix of textures and colors. He exuded a raw, untamed vitality that drew Eleanor in like a moth to a flame. Their first encounter was innocuous enough, a casual conversation over the low stone wall that separated their properties. But in that brief exchange, a spark ignited, an unspoken connection that hummed with an undercurrent of something dangerous and exciting. Eleanor found herself drawn to Daniel's youthful exuberance, his passionate discussions about art and life, a stark contrast to the sterile predictability of her own existence. And Daniel, in turn, was captivated by Eleanor's quiet elegance, her understated beauty, and the hint of vulnerability he sensed beneath her polished facade. As the weeks passed, their casual conversations by the stone wall evolved into stolen moments on Eleanor's back porch, hidden from the prying eyes of the neighborhood. Their initial flirtation blossomed into a full-blown affair, a dangerous dance fueled by the thrill of the forbidden. Eleanor, for the first time in years, felt alive, awakened from a long slumber by Daniel's touch, his words, his very presence. The emptiness that had haunted her for so long began to recede, replaced by a giddy excitement, a sense of reckless abandon she hadn't known she was capable of. Daniel, too, was consumed by the intensity of their connection. He found inspiration in Eleanor's beauty, his canvases filled with her image, her likeness captured in 1,000 different shades of light and shadow. Their affair was a secret world, a sanctuary built on stolen moments and whispered promises. They convinced themselves that their discretion would protect them, that their carefully constructed lies would keep their secret safe. But they were wrong. In a town like theirs, where whispers traveled faster than the wind, secrets rarely remained buried for long. Mrs. Peterson, a widow with a penchant for gardening and gossip, had lived across the street from the Vances for decades. Her eyes, sharp and observant, missed nothing. She had noticed Daniel's frequent visits, the way he lingered by Eleanor's side, the furtive glances they exchanged. She watched from behind her lace-curtained windows, her suspicions growing with each passing day. One afternoon, while tending her prize-winning roses, she saw Daniel slipping through Eleanor's back gate, his movements quick and secretive. A knowing smile played on Mrs. Peterson's lips. She had a story to tell, a juicy morsel of gossip to share with her circle of friends. And in a town as small and interconnected as theirs, it wasn't long before the whispers reached Richard. He returned home early one Friday evening, a surprise visit prompted by a canceled meeting in Boston. He called out Eleanor's name as he entered the house, but was met with an unsettling silence. As he walked towards the back of the house, he heard a muffled sound, a hushed whisper coming from the sunroom. He paused, his hand hovering over the doorknob, a sense of unease washing over him. He pushed the door open, and the scene that unfolded before him sent a shockwave through his very being. Eleanor and Daniel were standing close, their faces flushed, their bodies pressed together. They sprang apart, their eyes wide with panic, their carefully constructed world shattering around them. The silence in the sunroom was deafening, broken only by the frantic beating of Eleanor's heart. Richard stood frozen in the doorway, his face a mask of disbelief and hurt. The carefully constructed facade of their perfect life had crumbled, revealing the raw, painful truth beneath. Eleanor, caught in the harsh light of her husband's gaze, felt a wave of shame wash over her. She stammered, trying to explain, to offer some semblance of a justification for her actions, but the words caught in her throat. Daniel, equally stunned, remained silent, his eyes darting between Eleanor and Richard, searching for an escape route, a way out of the tangled web of deceit they had woven. I can explain," Eleanor finally managed, her voice trembling, but Richard simply raised a hand, silencing her unspoken pleas. He looked at her, his eyes filled with a mixture of pain and disgust, and then turned his gaze towards Daniel, his expression hardening. "Get out," he said, his voice low and menacing. "Get out of my house." Daniel, sensing the danger in the air, didn't hesitate. He slipped past Richard and out the back door, disappearing into the gathering dusk. Richard turned back to Eleanor, the silence between them heavy with unspoken accusations and recriminations. "We need to talk," he said, his voice cold and distant, the warmth and affection she had once known replaced by a chilling formality. The conversation that followed was a brutal dissection of their marriage, a painful post-mortem of a love that had slowly withered and died. Richard, his voice laced with bitterness, confronted Eleanor with the rumors he had heard, the whispers that had been circulating through the neighborhood. Eleanor, stripped bare of her carefully crafted defenses, confessed to the affair, the words tumbling out in a torrent of guilt and regret. The fight was explosive. Years of unspoken resentment and simmering frustrations boiling over in a torrent of accusations and recriminations. Richard, consumed by a sense of betrayal and wounded pride, lashed out at Eleanor, his words cutting deep, exposing the raw wounds of their failing marriage. Eleanor, overwhelmed by shame and remorse, retreated further into herself, the chasm between them widening with each passing moment. The days that followed were a blur of tense silences and strained conversations. The fragile truce they had brokered in the aftermath of Richard's discovery was constantly threatened by the undercurrent of hurt and anger that simmered beneath the surface. Eleanor, racked with guilt, tried to salvage what was left of their marriage, but Richard remained distant, his trust shattered, the wounds of her betrayal too deep to heal. He threw himself into his work, seeking solace in the familiar comfort of his demanding career, leaving Eleanor to grapple with the consequences of her actions alone. The weight of her secret, once a thrilling burden, now pressed down on her with crushing force, threatening to suffocate her beneath its oppressive weight. She knew she had to make a choice, to find a way to mend the fractured pieces of her life, but the path forward remained shrouded in uncertainty and fear. Eleanor, unable to bear the weight of her guilt and the suffocating tension in her marriage, decided to end the affair with Daniel. She knew it wouldn't be easy, but she believed it was the only way to begin to repair the damage she had caused. She arranged to meet him at a secluded spot by the lake, a place where they had shared stolen moments of passion and whispered promises of a future they both knew could never be. The air was heavy with the scent of approaching rain as Eleanor waited for Daniel, her heart pounding in her chest. When he arrived, his face was etched with worry, his eyes searching hers for answers he already feared. Eleanor, forcing herself to maintain a semblance of composure, explained her decision, her voice trembling slightly as she spoke of the need to end their affair, to focus on rebuilding her marriage. But Daniel, blinded by a mixture of love and possessiveness, refused to accept her decision. He pleaded with her, arguing that their love was worth fighting for, that they could find a way to be together, regardless of the consequences. Eleanor, torn between her lingering feelings for Daniel and her desire to salvage her marriage, stood firm. She reiterated her decision, her voice growing stronger with each word. Daniel's initial pleas turned to anger, his voice rising as he accused her of betraying him, of using him, of discarding him like a broken toy. The argument escalated, their words becoming sharper, more accusatory, the air between them crackling with tension. As the first drops of rain began to fall, the storm within them raged, threatening to consume them both. In a fit of rage, Daniel lashed out, grabbing Eleanor's arm, his grip tightening painfully. Eleanor cried out, struggling to break free, her fear escalating with each passing moment. She stumbled backward, her foot catching on a loose rock, sending her tumbling down the steep embankment towards the lake. The icy water engulfed her, the shock of the cold stealing her breath. Daniel, horrified by what he had done, scrambled down the embankment, reaching out to her, his voice choked with panic. "Eleanor!" he cried, his voice echoing across the now rain-lashed lake. "Eleanor, I'm so sorry." But it was too late. Eleanor, weighed down by her heavy coat, struggled in the churning water, her cries for help swallowed by the wind and the rain. Daniel, desperate to save her, plunged into the lake, his clothes dragging him down, the cold numbing his limbs. He fought against the current, his eyes searching frantically for any sign of Eleanor, but the darkness and the relentless rain obscured his vision. He called out her name again and again, his voice hoarse with desperation, but there was no response. Finally, exhausted and defeated, he stumbled back onto the shore, his body trembling, his clothes soaked through. The chilling realization of what he had done washing over him in a wave of overwhelming guilt and despair. He had killed the woman he loved, and now he was left alone with the devastating consequences of his actions. The following morning, Richard, his worry escalating after a sleepless night spent wondering where Eleanor could be, reported her missing to the police. Detective Miller, a seasoned investigator known for his sharp mind and unwavering dedication, was assigned to the case. He began by interviewing Richard, carefully noting his strained demeanor and the subtle inconsistencies in his account of Eleanor's disappearance. Miller's instincts told him that there was more to this story than met the eye. He expanded his investigation, questioning neighbors, friends, and anyone who might have had contact with Eleanor in the days leading up to her disappearance. Mrs. Peterson, eager to share her observations, recounted her suspicions about Eleanor and Daniel, describing their clandestine meetings and the growing tension she had sensed between them. Miller, his interest piqued, focused his attention on Daniel, bringing him in for questioning. Daniel, still reeling from the events of the previous night, his clothes damp and his eyes bloodshot, offered a hesitant and evasive account of his last encounter with Eleanor. Miller, a master of interrogation, observed Daniel's every move, every flicker of emotion, every carefully chosen word. He sensed Daniel's guilt, the carefully concealed panic that lurked beneath his facade of innocence. The discovery of Eleanor's body, washed ashore a few miles down the lake, confirmed Miller's suspicions. The autopsy report, detailing the cause of death as drowning, coupled with the evidence of a recent struggle, pointed towards foul play. Miller, armed with Mrs. Peterson's testimony and Daniel's unconvincing alibi, obtained a warrant for his arrest. Daniel was charged with manslaughter, his world crumbling around him as he was led away in handcuffs, the weight of his actions pressing down on him with crushing force.